Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and another video. This week I wanted to paint something botanical after being inspired whilst out on a walk, but I couldn't decide whether to paint using regular watercolour paints or to try my watercolour pencils for a change. I posted a poll on YouTube and Instagram to see what you guys would prefer, and it turns out there was a pretty even split of votes. So the only thing I could think to do was to use both and do two paintings, one with watercolour paint and one with watercolour pencils. It'll give me a good chance to compare them both side by side, which I haven't done before, and chat a bit about any similarities and differences, as well as the pros and cons of each, so I hope you enjoy the video. For my materials, I have the 36 set of Faber Castell Albrecht Durer watercolour pencils, and for the watercolour paint, I'm going to be using my 24 set of Winsor and Newton Professional watercolours. I'll be painting in the A5 Watercolour Sketchbook by Etchr that I reviewed a few weeks back, and I'll leave a link to that video at the end of this one if you want to go and check it out. Now for a direct comparison, it would obviously be best to paint the same picture twice, but I thought it would be more fun and interesting to do two different paintings. So I'll be painting a holly leaf and berries with the watercolour pencils and a pine cone with my watercolour paints. If you'd like me to do a more direct comparison in a future video, then please let me know in the comments box. I started on the holly leaf first and began by using the pencils dry to map out the main colours and areas of light and dark. I used a mixture of walnut brown and magenta on the branch, and some earth green yellowish around the outside of each leaf and on the veins down the centre. Then I used some dark cadmium orange on the berries and left some of the white of the paper free of pencil for the highlight areas. I also layered over some pale geranium lake around the edges of the berries. For the leaves, I began by applying my lightest colours first, starting with a light layer of light ultramarine blue into the highlight areas. This helps to give the leaves shape and form and help them look more realistic than just leaving all these lighter areas the white of the paper. I use a light pressure on my pencil so as not to damage the tooth of the paper, and work in a circular motion for maximum coverage. Next, it was time to add some of the darkest green I have in this set, which is the dark phthalo green. In this 36 set of pencils, I only have a fairly limited selection of green shades, a lot of which are quite light, so I knew from the start that I'd have to apply several layers of different colours to get a dark holly leaf green. I was hoping that when I added water to activate the pencils, they would mix on the paper rather like regular watercolour paints to create the darker shade of green I was after. Obviously though, Faber Castell do make larger sets of these pencils which, with a bigger range of colours, would have made life a bit easier here. But being that they are watercolour pencils, it should be possible to use, layer and mix them in a variety of ways, just like regular watercolour paint, and I'll be testing out a few different options as we go through the video. I'm adding in some mauve on top of the green for the darkest shadow areas now, before then going in with some of the mid-tone greens to flesh out the rest of the leaves. A lot of people will choose to work from light to dark colours when using colour pencils or watercolour, but recently I've started putting in my lightest and darkest areas in first, and then filling in the mid-tones afterward. And I found it really helps to get a good range of values into your artwork right from the start. I also find it easier and quicker too, but that's just the way I'm doing things here, so you should stick with whatever works for you. With a few layers of pencil down, it's now time to add some water, and for this I'm using my Derwent fine-tipped water brush. It was a bit hard to judge what colour I was going to get when I added water, but I do find these pencils activate really well, and the colours become far brighter and more vibrant than in their dry state. I would advise you to work from lighter areas first though, as if you do it the other way round, you could pull dark pigment from your brush into the areas you want to keep light. I also find that I had to keep cleaning off my brush in between water applications to keep control of mixing and blending, so I would also suggest not adding too much water, at least until you get a feel for how these pencils work. I've only used this set of watercolour pencils to paint one other piece in the past and found they took a bit of getting used to. So if you're more familiar with them and have any hints or tips to share, then please do drop them in the comments box below. So once that first layer had dried, I decided to try another method for paint mixing, and that was to use a separate sheet of scrap paper, a bit like a palette. That way I would know exactly how my colour was going to look on paper and adjust and experiment with the colours as needed before applying paint to my sketchbook. This did give me more flexibility and control over the colour I was mixing, but the downside to this was that once the pencil was activated with water, it dried very quickly and meant I had to keep reapplying and remixing the colour I wanted, which was a bit frustrating. Nonetheless, the second layer of activated pencil did lay down well over the first dry layer, much as you would expect watercolour to. Here I'm mixing phthalo green with indigo to get a dark blue-green shade. I also start to add in some lighter greens like emerald green and leaf green, and some earth green yellowish too. With that second layer all dry, I then went back over the leaves again with the dry pencil, as I felt a bit more confident by now of how the colours laid down and mixed together. I hadn't achieved exactly the colour I wanted, but the leaves were starting to take shape, albeit slowly. The whole process did seem to take longer than I remembered from my last full painting with them though, so as much as they may be convenient to travel with or carry around, well, the smaller sets anyway, and have the flexibility that they can be used wet or dry, I was surprised at how long this simple holly leaf took to complete. Again though, that may just be my inexperience with them. Now, one thing I did find quite clever with these watercolour pencils was that you could lift some of the pencil off the paper with a regular plastic eraser, even once the paints had been activated and dried. I was able to use this to my advantage to pull out a few lighter areas on the leaf that I'd lost sight of a bit, and although it was subtle, it meant I didn't have to go over with a regular white colour pencil or something like that, so it was all good. It probably means that you'd need to either spray or protect your work once you're done though, to avoid it rubbing off in your sketchbook. That said, these pencils are artist quality and do have optimal light resistance. Okay, so one more thing I wanted to try with these pencils before moving on to my next painting was the wet in wet technique, which I really like to use as a loose background. Again, I used my scrap piece of paper to lay down some indigo pigment and pre-wet my paper before activating the pencil. Then I simply dropped in the colour to the wet paper and kept the edges soft by using a clean damp brush. And I have to say, it did work just like regular watercolour. There are also a few other techniques you can try with these pencils that I didn't use today, such as using the pencil directly onto wet paper for a more intense result, or splattering, which you can do by taking the lead from the pencil nib with, say, a sandpaper block or sharpener. To finish with, I added a few last details to the tips of each leaf with a burnt ochre pencil. I don't love how it turned out and think it still looks a bit unfinished and sketchy, but I didn't feel like spending any more time on it, so I called it finished for now and moved on to the pinecone painting. As I said in the beginning of the video, for this I'm using Winsor and Newton Professional watercolours in pans. I started with a branch for a change and applied a dilute wash of raw umber onto dry paper. While the paint was wet, I dropped in some Payne's Grey to the underside of the branch and pinecone and let it mix together on the paper. And I know I may be biased in favour of watercolour paints, but it was so easy to get a nice smooth even layer of paint down compared with the watercolour pencils. Anyway, then I went on to paint the whole pinecone with a dilute wash of raw sienna, again onto dry paper, as this was going to be my lightest value. With that dry, I then turned my attentions to the darkest values, first trying burnt sienna, but then moving on to a more concentrated burnt umber. In comparison to the watercolour pencils, I felt that working with watercolour paints again was a lot easier and the results were far smoother and more predictable. But again, that may just be down to familiarity or lack of it in the case of the pencils. It was also nice to have more time to mix the watercolour paints on my palette compared to mixing the pencils on a separate sheet of paper that dries quickly. But what I should have done was to perhaps try mixing the pencils on a non-absorbent surface instead, which I imagine would have solved this problem. Perhaps I'm not being fair to the watercolour pencils and I'm not knocking their quality, as they are vibrant, disperse extremely easily in water and can be used in a variety of different ways. They can be used wet or dry, can be layered, lifted and used just like watercolour. But I can't help thinking that if you want a coloured pencil, you use a coloured pencil, and if you want to paint with watercolour and get watercolour effects, why not just use watercolour paints? I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Am I being totally ignorant? If you are someone who uses watercolour pencils a lot in your artwork, then how do you use them? Let me know in the comments below. So back to the pinecone and filling in some more of those mid-tone values. After putting in the darkest values with the burnt umber, I then went in with burnt sienna, and now I'm adding a more red-orange glaze on top, working on dry paper again. Now, having built up the values on the pinecone, it's easy to see that I need to go back to the branch to adjust the darker shadow areas here. For this, I'm using a mixture of Payne's Grey with some leftover burnt sienna and burnt umber on my palette. I add a bit more concentrated burnt umber and use the tip of my brush to mark in the details around the bottom of the pinecone. And further adjust some of the darker areas further up too, by adding in a bit more red to the burnt umber. Next, it's time to add a few details and markings. So all that's left to do now is a bit of background. I'm going to use the wet on wet technique again, like I did for the holly leaf. So I pre-wet the paper around the pinecone first and drop in paint to the wet paper. I've gone for a bit of Prussian blue here, mixed in with some leftover green that was on my palette. I'm also adding in a few pine needles. And with that, I'm going to call it done. I'm really happy with how the pine cone turned out and think it was really interesting to use these two supplies side by side today, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Let me know which painting you prefer, and please, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new to my channel. I really appreciate all your support and wish you all a very happy and peaceful holidays. I'll be back in the new year with lots more arty content and lots of new video ideas too. But until then, take care and thanks for watching. Bye.